I remember the silence of that boardroom as vividly as I remember the sound of my own heartbeat. It wasn't the quiet that comes from peace. It was the kind that suffocates. A silence too deliberate, too staged, like the room itself was waiting for me to break. The papers sat in front of me, stacked neatly, the company's logo embossed at the top of each page. At first glance, they looked ordinary, just another round of approvals. But the more my eyes traced the paragraphs, the more I felt that gnawing unease. Dates that didn't add up. Inspection records that were conveniently completed on days I knew the equipment sat idle. Safety checks signed by men who'd already been laid off. The omissions screamed louder than the words on the page. I glanced around the table. A dozen eyes watched me, some with expectation, some with irritation. My boss, Richard, sat across from me, tailored suit, slick hair, smile that never reached his eyes. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke in that hunted, dismissive tone he used when he wanted compliance. Be a team player, Daniel. Just sign it. My hand twitched toward the pen. I could feel the weight of my father's old watch on my wrist, the leather strap worn smooth after decades of use. That watch had always been more than a timepiece. My father gave it to me the day I started this job, saying, "A man's word should be as steady as the time he keeps." At the time, I thought it was sentimental nonsense. But in that moment, the watch felt like an anchor, heavy, immovable, keeping me from drifting into the easy lie they wanted me to tell. I pushed the pen back across the table. No, these aren't accurate. There are inspections missing, entire sections left blank. If something goes wrong... Richard cut me off with a smile so thin it could slice skin. Nothing's going to go wrong. We've been running this plant for decades. You think too much, Daniel. Sometimes caution is the enemy of progress. I heard a low chuckle from one of the managers at the far end. My chest boned, but I forced my voice to stay steady. Progress doesn't mean gambling with people's lives. I'm not signing it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Richard leaned back, lacing his fingers together, smirk etched into his face. Careful men don't last long here. The words landed like a curse. The meeting went on without me. Papers shuffled to another hand, another signature scrawled without hesitation. My refusal was treated like a minor inconvenience, a buzzing fly swatted aside. Yet I knew something had shifted. That night, I couldn't sleep. My wife asked why I was so restless, but I didn't have the words. All I could think about was that smake, that threat hidden in the casual tone. Careful men don't last long. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the tick of my father's watch on the nightstand, each second loud as a hammer strike. By the end of the week, the letter came, folded neatly in a plain envelope, delivered to my desk like it was just another memo. Effective immediately, you are reassigned to an advisory role. Demoted, stripped of authority, stripped of the office I'd worked a decade to earn. My replacement, a younger man with an eager smile and a spine made of rubber, was already moving his things into my chair before I even cleared out mine. The humiliation was surgical. Not a dramatic firing, not a confrontation. Just a slow erasure. People who once stopped by my office to chat now avoided my eyes. In the cafeteria, whispers rose and died whenever I walked past. I became a ghost haunting the halls I used to command. At home, the silence grew heavier. My wife tried to be supportive at first, but I saw the questions in her eyes, the disappointment she tried to hide. My son asked me once, "Dad, why aren't you the boss anymore?" I had no answer that didn't taste like ash. Each night, I wound the watch on my wrist, listening to the click of the mechanism, reminding myself that time still moved forward, even if I felt trapped. But a darker thought gnawed at me. If they could take my position, my respect, my identity so easily, what else were they willing to take? That question hung over me like a shadow, and I feared the answer. When I think back to how it all started, I almost laugh at my own naivety. Almost. The truth is, there's nothing funny about giving years of your life to something that was never built to last. I was 25 when I walked through the glass doors of Fairchild Industries for the first time. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and ambition. I wore my only decent suit, dark gray, a little too tight in the shoulders, and I clutched the briefcase my wife had given me as a wedding gift. Inside were fresh copies of my resume, but what I really carried that day was hope. Hope that this job would be the foundation of everything I promised her. A house, stability, a life where she'd never have to worry about the bills the way my mother once did. My first manager, old Mr. Briggs, clapped me on the back after my orientation and said, "Keep your head down, son, and you'll do fine here." That became my mantra. Keep my head down. Work hard. Be the man everyone could rely on. And for a while, it worked. I was never the loudest in the room, never the one cracking jokes at happy hour, but I was a guy who stayed late to finish reports, who double-checked numbers, who made sure the safety valve was tested twice instead of once. That reliability earned me nods from supervisors, and eventually it earned me Richard's attention. Back then, Richard was charming. Or maybe I was just too eager to believe he was. He told me once, after I pulled a double shift fixing an error that wasn't even mine, "You're the most reliable guy on the floor, Daniel." I wore that praise like armor. I didn't realize it was a leash. At home, I was building something too. My wife, Claire, and I had just bought a small starter home, 2 bedrooms, beige siding, the kind of place realtors describe as full of potential. I still remember the smell of fresh paint on our first night there, and how Claire lit candles in the kitchen to make it feel less empty. I promised her I'd fill that house with laughter, with security. I promised her she wouldn't have to work 2 jobs the way her mother did. I believed that every overtime shift, every weekend spent at the office, was an investment in that promise. But promises have a way of turning into chains. I missed our first anniversary dinner because of a production delay. Missed my son's first soccer goal because I was on a conference call. Each time, I told myself it was temporary, that the grind would pay off, that the house would be more than siding and potential. Claire tried to be patient. She'd leave my dinner in the oven, text me photos of our boy holding up drawings with Daddy scrawled in crooked letters. But patience has limits. I'd come home to her sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in front of her, eyes shadowed with disappointment she no longer bothered to hide. "Daniel," she'd say, "you're missing it. You're missing us." And I'd kiss her forehead, promise to do better, then set my alarm for 5 a.m. to beat traffic into the plant. Looking back, I see the red flags everywhere. Safety reports altered at the last minute. Projects rushed to meet impossible deadlines. Inspectors who conveniently looked the other way. I noticed them. Of course I did. But every time, I rationalized. If I push too hard, I'll be seen as a problem. If I make noise, I'll jeopardize everything I'm building for my family. So I stayed silent. One night, after a minor accident in the warehouse, a forklift tipped, no one badly hurt. I sat at the dining table with Claire. She was clearing plates when I said, "It could have been worse." She stopped, plate in hand, and looked at me. "Then why do you sound relieved instead of angry?" I didn't know how to answer her. Anger would have meant admitting the company I bled for was careless. Anger would have meant I'd have to make a choice. So I swallowed it. I told myself I was protecting her, protecting us. My brother, Michael, saw through it faster than anyone. We were at a barbecue one summer, and he leaned close, beer in hand, voice low. "You give too much to them. Danny, they'll bleed you dry and toss you aside the second it suits them." I laughed it off, told him he didn't understand, told him loyalty mattered. But loyalty, I would learn, is only noble when it's mutual. The years blurred. Promotions came, small raises that felt like breadcrumbs. I was proud when I got my own office, when I hung my diplomas on the wall, when I placed my father's watch on the desk as a reminder of how far I'd come. That watch ticked steady through endless meetings, through nights when I slept on the couch in my office instead of driving home. But with each tick, it also measured what I was losing. Claire stopped waiting up. My son stopped asking if I'd come to his games. The house, once filled with candles and laughter, grew colder, quieter. I told myself it was worth it, that stability came first, that sacrifices now meant comfort later. I convinced myself I was building something solid. What I didn't realize was that I was building on sand, and the tide was already coming in. The day they took down my nameplate, I knew something inside me had broken. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting match, no meeting with HR, no grand announcement. Just a quiet, almost indifferent removal. I'd stepped out for lunch, a turkey sandwich I barely tasted. And when I came back, the small brass plaque that had carried my name for 6 years was gone from the office door. In its place was a strip of tape holding up a paper sign with someone else's name written in bold, confident letters. Assistant Director, Jason McCarthy. Jason, the eager young man with a permanent smile, who never asked too many questions and always signed whatever was put in front of him. I watched him through the glass, moving his things into my office with an energy that made my stomach turn. My office, my diplomas, the watch I had set on the desk so many times. All of it swept aside, erased as if I had never been there at all. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have, a man with no place to go. People passed by without meeting my eyes. One or two gave me sympathetic glances, but sympathy felt like pity, and pity was worse than contempt. I retreated to my new advisory workspace, a cubicle shoved into a corner of the operations floor. No door, no privacy, just beige walls and the constant hum of printers. My authority had vanished overnight. I wasn't part of decisions anymore. I was a ghost, tolerated but not respected. The whisper started soon after. At first, subtle, a laugh that cut off when I entered the break room, the shift in tone when I passed by conversations. Then clearer. His too cautious. Couldn't handle the pressure. Companies moving forward, and is stuck in the past. Unstable, if you ask me. I wanted to defend myself, to shout that I wasn't unstable, that I had been careful because lives depended on it. But the more I tried, the more I realized no one was listening. In a place where loyalty was measured by silence, my refusal to sign that paper had branded me as the enemy. The humiliation didn't stop at work. It followed me home like a shadow. Claire noticed a change immediately. I'd walk in later than ever, not because of overtime, but because I couldn't bear to come home with the taste of failure still fresh in my mouth. She'd look up from the kitchen table, her eyes sharp with unspoken questions. "What happened now?" she asked one night, when I tossed my jacket over a chair with more force than necessary. "They reassigned me," I said flatly, "took me out of management." She blinked, trying to master reaction, but I saw it, the flicker of disappointment, the worry about bills, the fear that the life we had built was slipping. "So you're what?" "Just some advisor now." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it cut. My son, sitting at the table with homework spread before him, looked up with wide eyes. "Dad, why aren't you the boss anymore?" I had no answer that didn't make me feel smaller. I tried to bury myself in routine, but shame clung to me. Each morning, I knotted my tie, wound my father's watch, and stared into the bathroom mirror. The man looking back seemed hollowed out, as though someone had drained the color from my face. The watch ticked steadily, mocking me with its constancy. My father had worn it through years of honest labor, building something with callous hands. And here I was, undone by a refusal to lie. The final blow came weeks later. I was walking past the cafeteria when I overheard Jason and a few others talking. They didn't notice me at first. Nearly had a scare yesterday. Jason laughed, shoving a fork into his salad. Valve malfunctioned during the test run. Could have been a disaster. Yeah, but management smoothed it over. Didn't even make it to the official logs. Still, imagine if Daniel had been in charge. He'd have shut the whole place down. Guy was a walking brake pedal. They laughed. My name had become a punchline. I froze, rage and humiliation churning inside me. Because I knew that the Nate accident was exactly what I'd warned about. The falsified safety documents, the skipped inspections, it was all coming true. And yet, instead of being vindicated, I was painted as a problem. That night, I sat alone on the porch of our house. The autumn air was cold, leaves scraping across the driveway in the wind. Claire had gone to bed after another argument about money, and my son had retreated to his room without a word. I held my father's watch in my palm, feeling its weight, listening to the faint tick. The street light cast a pale glow across the metal, and for a moment I imagined hurling it into the darkness, watching it vanish into the storm drain, erasing the burden of memory it carried. I even stood, walked halfway down the driveway with my hand clenched tight around it. But I stopped, because if I threw it away, what would I have left? That watch was the last tether to a man who believed in honor, who taught me that cutting corners was a coward's path. Losing my title, my office, even my family's respect, all of that was already slipping. But if I let go of my integrity, then I'd truly have nothing. I sank back onto the porch steps, head in my hands, the watch cold against my skin. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to weep, not the quiet tears of frustration, but the raw, shuddering sobs of a man who realizes the ground beneath him has crumbled. And yet, beneath that collapse, something faint stirred. A whisper, "You're still standing." It didn't feel like strength, not yet. More like defiance, fragile, barely there, but present. I didn't know what it meant or where it would lead. All I knew was that even as they strip away everything I thought defined me, I was still breathing, still holding on to the one thing they couldn't take: time. And the truth. The watch ticked on, steady as ever. I didn't pack much the night I left. A duffel bag with some clothes, my worn leather journal, and my father's watch. That was all. No grand speeches, no slammed doors, just a quiet departure at dawn while the house still slept. The air smelled of burnt coffee from a pot I'd forgotten to turn off the night before. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the countertops. I paused in the doorway, looking back at the house I had promised would be our sanctuary. It was silent now, hollow, stripped of warmth. The laughter Claire and I once dreamed of filling it with had long since faded into arguments and cold dinners. I closed the door softly behind me. The highway stretched out like an artery into nowhere. I drove without music, the hum of the tires and the ticking of the watch on my wrist the only rhythms I could stand. Towns blurred past, gas stations, faded billboards, clusters of houses clinging to the edges of interstate exits. The farther I drove, the lighter I felt, as though every mile peeled away another layer of suffocation. I ended up in a coastal town 3 hours from the city. The kind of place tourists forgot existed, where the paint on shop signs peeled in the sun and the ocean carried the smell of salt and rusted docks. I rented a cottage from an old woman who barely looked up from her crossword as she handed me the keys. "It's nothing fancy," she said. "Roof leaks when it rains. But it'll do." And it did. The cottage had peeling wallpaper, a single creaking bed, and windows that rattled when the wind blew. But when I opened the back door, I was met with a sound of waves crashing against rocks. The ocean stretched out, endless and indifferent, a vastness that made my problem feel both smaller and sharper at once. For days, I barely moved. I slept too much, ate too little. I sat on the porch with my father's watch ticking in my palm, listening to gulls wheel overhead. I wrote in my journal until my hand cramped, filling page after page with confessions I had never spoken aloud: the shame of failure, the fear of being forgotten, the bitterness toward Claire, the ache of missing my son. The silence was brutal at first. At home, even in the worst times, there had been noise, the TV in the background, Claire's footsteps, my son's laughter or his bedroom door slamming. Hey, there was nothing but waves and wind. The silence forced me to hear myself, and what I heard was ugly. But slowly, the silence became something else. One morning, I woke before dawn and walked down to the shore. The sand was cold under my shoes, the horizon bruised with shades of purple and gray. I stood there as the sun broke over the water, its light spilling like molten gold across the waves. For the first time in years, I felt small in a way that wasn't humiliating. Small in a way that was freeing. In town, I met people who didn't care about resumes or job titles. There was Sam, an old fisherman with a back bent like driftwood, who let me help untangle his nets one afternoon. "Patience," he grunted when I grew frustrated. "The knots don't care if you're in a hurry." His words stuck with me. And there was Nora, who ran the local bookstore. She noticed me thumbing through manuals on engineering and safety codes one day. "You're not here on vacation, are you?" she asked with a knowing smile. I shook my head, just trying to remember who I am. She didn't pry. She just rang up the books and slipped an extra journal into the bag. "On the house," she said. "Sometimes writing it down is the only way through." Still, survival wasn't easy. My savings dwindled faster than I'd expected. Nights grew long and restless when bills loomed in the back of my mind. There were moments when I considered crawling back, to the city, to the company, even to Claire's disapproving silence, just to feel stable again. But each time, I touched the watch on my wrist. The steady tick reminded me of my father's words. A man is measured not by what he gains, but by what he refuses to lose. I refused to lose myself again. So I learned to live differently. I repaired the leaky roof of the cottage with my own hands, patch by patch. I cooked simple meals, eggs, beans, rice, and savored them instead of scarfing them down between meetings. I ran along the shoreline, lungs burning, until exhaustion drowned out the noise in my head. And slowly, something shifted. One evening, as I fixed a broken chair in the cottage, gluing and clamping the pieces back together, I realized I was doing the same with myself. Reassembling the parts, mending cracks that had seemed permanent. The chair would always show its scars, and so would I. But it would stand again. So would I. The ocean became my confessional. On stormy nights, I'd sit on the porch and watch the waves batter the rocks, relentless and unforgiving. They reminded me of the company, of Richard, of the life I had left, forces that tried to wear me down until nothing was left. But each morning, the sea was still there, reshaped but unbroken. I began to believe I could be the same. Weeks turned into months. My journal filled with less bitterness and more plans. I started offering advice to local business owners who needed help with safety standards. Word spread. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. Work that mattered. Work where being careful wasn't a liability, but a gift. And in those small victories, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive hope of a young man walking into a corporate lobby for the first time. Not the desperate hope of a husband promising his wife the grind would pay off. This was different. Quieter. Stronger. It was the hope of a man who had lost everything false and was beginning to uncover something true. The first sign of change came not with a grand revelation, but with a knock on the door. It was Nora from the bookstore, holding a cardboard box. "You left these behind," she said with a half-smile, setting the box on my porch. Inside were manuals, journals, and scribbled notes I'd forgotten while drinking too much stale coffee in her shop. "You're always buried in this stuff," she said. "You should do something with it." I almost laughed. Do something with it? I was a ghost of a man, barely paying rent on a cottage that smelled of mildew. But her word stuck. That night, I spread the manuals and journals across the kitchen table, pages fluttering under the hum of a cheap lamp. For the first time since leaving the company, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose. At first, it was small. A mechanic in town asked if I could look over his shop safety compliance forms. Then a restaurant owner. Then a construction crew about to start a project. I charged little, sometimes nothing at all, but word spread. People didn't want the shortcuts, the bribes, the hidden risks. They wanted someone who would actually care. Being too careful became my currency. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard had mocked me, branded me obsolete, broken. Yet here, in this forgotten coastal town, my floor was a lifeline. I carried my father's watch to every consultation, its tick grounding me as I explained protocols or rewrote reports. Sometimes, I catch myself glancing at it in meetings, not because I was pressed for time, but because I needed its steady reminder. Integrity is patient. But survival and small victories weren't enough. Something deeper began to stay. One evening, I sat by the ocean after a long day, the repaired chair creaking beneath me. The waves rolled in, steady and ceaseless, crashing and retreating with timeless rhythm. It hit me then. The company I'd left behind, with its shortcuts and falsified reports, was just another storm. Loud, destructive, but temporary. The truth, like the tide, would always return. That thought lit a fuse inside me. I began reaching out quietly to old colleagues. Not all of them. Most had turned their backs. But a few still respected me, still remembered the kind of man I was. Over beers in dimly lit bars or whispered phone calls late at night, stories came out. A forklift accident that was brushed off as minor. A chemical spill reclassified as contained when it wasn't. Inspectors bribed with envelopes slipped under tables. Each story was a puzzle piece. Each name, date, and file number scribbled into my journal. At first, it felt like obsession. Nights blurred as I cross-referenced regulations, collected public records, mapped out timelines. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized this was an obsession. It was clarity. I wasn't just rebuilding myself. I was building a case. The symbols of my rebirth were everywhere. The watch ticked steady as I filled binders with documents. The once broken chair held firm beneath me as I worked. Even the leaky roof I had patched became a metaphor. Floors can be repaired, but only if you face them directly. I caught my reflection in the cottage window one night and barely recognized a man staring back. The hollow-eyed ghost was gone. My shoulders sat straighter. My eyes held a sharper light. 4 years, I had measured myself by the company's yardstick: titles, salaries, recognition. Now, I was measuring myself by something different. By truth, by endurance, by the quiet power of patience. Money trickled in from consulting, enough to keep me afloat. But purpose was the real currency now. I saw it in the grateful handshake of the restaurant owner who knew his kitchen was finally safe. I saw it in the nod of the construction foreman who admitted, "No one ever bothered to explain this stuff before." Every act of integrity was a small rebellion against Richard and everything he stood for. And yet, a voice inside whispered that rebellion alone wasn't enough. The turning point came when one of my old colleagues, a soft-spoken engineer named Mark, visited the cottage. He looked thinner than I remembered, with worry lines carved deep around his mouth. "I shouldn't be here," he said nervously, glancing around as though someone had followed him. "But you need to see this." He slid a flash drive across my table. My hands trembled as I picked it up. "What is it?" "Everything," he said. "Emails, reports, photos. They've covered up more than you know." That night, I opened the files and felt the breath leave my chest. Images of corroded pipes marked as stable. Emails instructing supervisors to adjust numbers. Incident reports buried before reaching regulators. The evidence was undeniable. The company wasn't just careless. It was criminal. I sat there in the glow of the laptop, the ocean crashing beyond the window, and realized the path ahead was no longer survival. It was war. The next weeks became a blur of planning. I created binders, labeled and cross-referenced every piece of evidence. I spoke with lawyers in distant towns, careful not to leave a trail. I reached out to journalists discreetly, testing who could be trusted. And through it all, the symbols followed me like silent companions. The watch ticked steady, anchoring me in the long nights. The ocean roared outside, reminding me that truth was relentless. The repaired chair held me as I pieced my life, and my case, back together. With each file I added to the binders, I felt stronger, not in the arrogant way Richard strutted through the halls, but in a deeper, quieter way, the kind of strength that can't be taken away. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I caught myself standing straighter in the mirror. My face was leaner, my eyes sharper, but what struck me most was the absence of shame. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by what I'd lost. I was defined by what I was building. I whispered aloud to the empty room, testing the words. They thought careful men don't last long. I paused, the watch ticking on my wrist. But careful men outlast a storm. The words tasted like truth. And I knew then the time was coming. Not just to survive, not just to rebuild, but to confront. To take everything I had gathered, every scar I carried, and turn it into the one thing Richard had never expected me to have: power. The day I returned to the city, it felt like I was walking into a place I no longer belonged. The streets were louder than I remembered, filled with horns, chatter, and the constant hum of ambition. For months, I had lived by the rhythm of the ocean, the ticking of my father's watch. Now, every sound in the city felt rushed, desperate, grasping. But I wasn't desperate anymore. On my wrist, the watch ticked steady. In my bag, the binders of evidence rested like bricks of truth. And inside me, for the first time in years, was silence. Not the silence of shame or isolation, but the silence of man who has nothing left to lose and everything left to give. The confrontation wasn't just a meeting. It was a public inquiry, triggered by the journalists and lawyers I quietly partnered with. The board of directors had been forced to convene, their carefully pressed suits unable to shield them from the spotlight now glaring down. Reporters lined the back of the room. Cameras hummed quietly, red lights blinking like watchful eyes. And there, at the head of the table, sat Richard. Time had not changed him much. He still wore the same tailored suits, the same smug smile that suggested he had already won. When he saw me walk in, binder under my arm, his smirk deepened. "Well, if it isn't the careful man himself," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Back to waste more of our time." I didn't answer him. Not yet. I took my seat at the witness table, laid the binder gently on the wood, and placed my father's watch beside it. The tick was too soft for anyone else to hear, but for me, it filled the silence like a drumbeat. They started with formalities. A lawyer asked me to state my name, my years of service. Each word I spoke felt like peeling away another layer of the man I used to be. Then came the questions. "Mr. Hale, why did you refuse to sign the safety approvals last year?" "Because they were fraudulent," I said calmly. "They omitted required inspections. They endangered workers' lives. Signing them would have made me complicit in negligence." Richard leaned back, smirking. "We call it efficiency. Streamlining. Daniel was always too careful. He slowed things down." I opened the binder. Page after page of reports, photos, emails. My voice stayed steady as I walked them through each one. "This is not efficiency. This is corrosion labeled stable. This is a chemical leak labeled contained. This is bribery. This is a near-fatal accident that was buried." Whispers rippled through the room. A reporter scribbled furiously. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Richard's smirk faltered. The hours stretched long, but I didn't falter. Every time doubt crept in, I felt the watch against my wrist, steadying me. Every time Richard tried to interrupt, I held up another piece of evidence. At one point, he snapped, "You're bitter, Daniel, just a washed-up employee with a grudge." I met his eyes. If I were bitter, I would have stayed silent and let you bury yourself. This isn't bitterness, Richard. This is accountability. For the first time, the room applauded. But the confrontation wasn't only in that boardroom. That night, I went home. Not to the cottage by the sea, but to the house with the beige siding and the laughter that had long gone silent. Claire opened the door, surprise flickering in her eyes. She looked older, wearier, but so was I. "Daniel," she whispered, as though saying my name might break something fragile. "I needed to see you," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. We sat at the same kitchen table where so many arguments had once unfolded. The candles she used to light were gone. The table was bare. Our son's drawings no longer hung on the fridge. "I failed you," I said quietly. "Not just as a husband, as a father. I chose work over you, and when I finally stood for something, it was too late for us." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I was angry, Daniel. I won't lie. But I heard what you did today. Our son saw it on the news." He said, "Dad finally told the truth." The words hit me harder than anything Richard had ever thrown my way. For years, I thought my silence had erased me in my son's eyes. But telling the truth, standing firm when it mattered most, had written a different ending. Claire reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition. A closing of a wound, if not a healing of it. Weeks later, the inquiry's verdict came. Richard was stripped of his title, his reputation in shambles. The company faced lawsuits, regulators swarming like vultures. And me? I wasn't celebrated like a hero. But I was free. The final scene belongs to the ocean. I sat once again in the creaking chair on the cottage porch, the repaired wood firm beneath me. The binders were gone, handed to lawyers and journalists, no longer my burden. The air smelled of salt and possibility. I raised my wrist, feeling the weight of the watch. Its steady tick was the same as the day I'd almost thrown it into the river. But now, it didn't feel like a reminder of failure. It felt like a compass. Careful men don't last long here, Richard had told me once. I smiled faintly at the horizon, the waves rolling in with patient certainty. "No," I whispered into the wind. "Careful men outlast everything else." The tide roared, eternal and steady. And for the first time in years, I felt eternal too.